This is my final log. The rules were simple. Don't look at the horizon after 3 a.m. Don't answer familiar voices on the radio. They're not for safety. They're to keep you from noticing, from understanding that these towers don't just send signals out. They're listening posts. And something ancient, something that wears the sky, has just learned our name. My name is Leo Kincaid. For 12 years, I've been a telecom maintenance technician. It's a job most people don't think about. You just want the 5 bars on your phone, the seamless connection to the world. You don't think about the guy who climbs 1,000 feet of skeletal steel into the sky, often in the dead of night, to make sure you can post a picture of your dinner. And honestly, I like it that way. The anonymity is part of the appeal. Up there, the world makes sense. It's a world of physics and engineering, signal propagation, passive intermodulation, azimuth alignment, decibel loss. Every problem has a logical cause and a technical solution. I've worked through hurricanes, blizzards, and heat waves that made the steel too hot to touch. I've always been in control. The tower is my office, the sky my ceiling. There's a profound peace you can only find when you're a tiny speck on a needle, looking down on an ocean of green, the concerns of the world shrinking to miniature. My specialty is remote and difficult terrain. That's why I got the call for the Allegheny Ridge contract in West Virginia, a series of 6 towers deep in the Appalachian wilderness, notorious for equipment failure and bizarre signal interference. For me, it was just another challenge, a puzzle to be solved with a wrench and a spectrum analyzer. The pay was excellent and the contract offered a solitude I craved. Just me, the mountains, and a problem to fix. I met my company contact, a man named Henderson, at a dusty diner an hour outside the access zone. He was a pale, jittery man who looked like he hadn't slept in a week. He slid a thick binder of schematics across the sticky table. "Everything you need is in there, Kincaid," he said, avoiding my eyes. "Frequencies, hardware specs, access codes." "Standard stuff," I said, flipping through the pages. "Anything I should know about the terrain? Local wildlife being a nuisance. Heard you get some big black bears out here." Henderson just shook his head, stirring his black coffee with a frantic energy. "The terrain's rough, but you've handled worse. It's the sites themselves. They're sensitive." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small laminated card, about the size of a credit card. It looked old, the edges worn smooth. He pushed it across the table like it was a venomous snake. "This goes with you. Keep it on your person at all times. Company policy for this specific contract. Memorize it." I picked it up. The card had no company logo. It was just white, with black sans serif text. The title read, Supplemental High Altitude Safety Protocols, AR01 through AR06. I read the rules. My brow furrowed, and a slow smile spread across my face. This had to be a joke, a hazing ritual for the new guy. The rules weren't technical. They weren't about safety harnesses or radio frequency exposure limits. They were bizarre. There were 5 in total, but these were the 3 that stuck out. During nocturnal maintenance, 22 Saro, 06 Zaro, if you are on the tower between 03 Mer and 04 Saro, do not look directly at the horizon. Monitor your equipment displays only. If you hear a familiar, unprompted voice on your closed-channel comms that does not follow standard identification protocol, do not respond. It is not who you think it is. If the ambient static on your communication gear forms a sustained melodic pattern, cease all work and begin your descent immediately. Do not look up during the descent. I let out a short laugh. "All right, you got me. Is this some kind of local ghost story trying to spook the new guy?" Henderson didn't laugh. He just stared into his coffee cup. "They're not my rules, Kincaid. They're just the rules. Follow them. That's all I can tell you." He finished his coffee in one gulp, threw a few dollars on the table and walked out without another word, leaving me alone with the schematics and the strange, laminated card. I shook my head, tucked the card into my wallet, and chalked it up to the eccentricities of working in the deep woods. People out here had their superstitions. It was probably a story that started years ago. Maybe a tech got spooked by a weird radio echo, and it just grew into this ridiculous ritual. My world was one of logic. I had work to do. The first week was completely normal. I worked on towers AR01 and AR02. The work was tough, the climbs long, but the problems were standard. A corroded amplifier on one, a misaligned dish on the other. The views were breathtaking. The silence was absolute, broken only by the wind whistling through the steel lattice. I felt at home. I completely forgot about Henderson and his ridiculous rules. The call came on the 8th night. A critical failure at Tower AR-03. A nearby town had lost all its emergency services communication. It was a priority 1 repair. I checked the time, 11:30 p.m. A night climb. I felt the familiar rush of adrenaline and purpose. I gathered my gear, sent a quick text to my wife, Sarah. "Heading up for a night job, honey, love you." And drove my truck up the winding unpaved road to the base of the tower. KR-03 was a monster, a self-supporting lattice tower rising over 1,200 feet from a small clearing on a mountain peak. The night was clear and moonless, the stars blazing with an intensity you never see in the city. It was cold, the kind of deep, biting cold that seeps into your bones. I started my ascent, the rhythmic clang of my boots on the rungs and the click-slide of my safety clips the only sounds in the universe. The climb took over an hour. By the time I reached the main antenna array near the top, I was in a state of deep focus. The world below was gone, just a black void. It was just me, my tools, and the complex machinery humming around me. I diagnosed the problem quickly. A main power conduit had shorted out. It was a tricky but manageable fix. I set up my work lights, their harsh white beams cutting through the oppressive darkness, and got to work. Time melts away when I'm in the zone. I was splicing wires, checking voltage, my mind completely absorbed by the task. The wind was a low, mournful sigh around me. I finished the main splice and began the system reboot sequence. I glanced at my watch to log the time. 3:15 a.m. The number registered, and for a fleeting moment, I remembered the laminated card. "If you are on the tower between 03 South and 04 Azon." A faint, amused smile touched my lips. I shook my head and turned back to my diagnostic tablet. Superstition. That's when I heard it. A soft crackle in my headset, the one I used to communicate with the ground crew, which of course was empty for a solo night job. Then a voice so clear and warm it cut through the cold and the dark like a beacon, a voice I knew better than my own. "Leo, honey, are you okay? You're taking a long time." It was Sarah. For a single beautiful second, my heart leaped. I opened my mouth to respond. "Sarah, how are you?" And then logic, cold and brutal, slammed into me like a physical blow. This was a closed-channel line-of-sight radio. It had a maximum range of maybe 2 miles. Sarah was over 300 miles away, fast asleep in our bed. There was no network relay, no phone patch. It was electronically, physically, fundamentally impossible. My blood turned to ice water. My hand froze, hovering over the transmit button on my headset. Rule number 2. If you hear a familiar, unprompted voice on your closed-channel comms, do not respond. It is not who you think it is. The voice came again, laced with a perfect imitation of my wife's gentle concern. "Leo, can you hear me? I'm worried." My throat was tight. Every instinct screamed at me to answer, to soothe the worry in that impossible voice. But Henderson's pale, terrified face flashed in my mind. The absurdity of the rules no longer felt funny. It felt like a lifeline. I stayed silent, my knuckles white as I gripped a steel strut. And then I saw it. I had a small analog signal strength meter on my diagnostic panel, a piece of old but reliable gear. It was supposed to be measuring ambient RF noise. The needle should have been sitting near 0 with occasional random jitters. It wasn't. The needle was pulsing. It was lifting to the halfway mark, holding for a second, then dropping back to 0, then lifting again. A slow, steady, deliberate rhythm. Pulse. Pause. Pulse. Pause. Like a heartbeat. It was a signal. A clean, powerful, and utterly alien signal. And it wasn't random. It was a pattern. I stared at the pulsing needle, my mind, which was so used to finding logical explanations, coming up completely empty. This wasn't interference, this wasn't a technical glitch, this was something else. This was a violation. The voice in my headset spoke one last time, no longer warm, but with a chilling, flat emptiness. "We see you, Leo." The pulsing on the meter stopped. The needle dropped to 0, the voice was gone. I was left in absolute silence, 1,000 feet up in a cold, star-drenched sky, completely and utterly alone. Or so I had thought. The rules weren't a joke. They were a warning. And I had just met what they were warning me about. My sanctuary had become a cage, and the quiet of the mountains was no longer peaceful. It was watchful. Something is up here in the sky with me, something that knows my wife's voice and can make my instruments beat like a heart. And I still have 4 more towers to fix. If you want to know what I find, if you want to understand what is sending that signal, subscribe and turn on notifications. Because my investigation has just begun, and I have a terrible feeling I'm not the one in control. The descent from Tower AR-03 was the longest 1,000 feet of my life. Every rung of the ladder was a conscious, deliberate act of will. My mind, a place that had always been a fortress of logic and process, was now a chaotic echo chamber. "We see you, Leo." The phrase played on a loop, devoid of the warmth it had mimicked, a sterile and predatory declaration. The wind, which had been a familiar companion for 12 years, now seemed to whisper fragments of that impossible voice. I didn't dare look out at the horizon. My world had shrunk to the 3-foot circle of steel illuminated by my headlamp. My trusted instruments, the extensions of my senses, had betrayed me. That pulsing needle, a calm, rhythmic beat in the face of the impossible, was seared into my memory. It wasn't a malfunction, it was a message. Back on the ground, the solidity of the earth did little to calm the tremor in my hands. The forest, which had seemed majestic and peaceful on the drive up, now felt like a living entity, its ancient trees the silent witnesses to my terrifying epiphany. The drive back to my rented cabin was a blur of gravel roads and dancing shadows cast by my headlights. I didn't turn on the radio. The silence was a fragile shield I was desperate to maintain. I kept glancing at my comms unit, sitting inert on the passenger seat, half expecting it to flicker to life and speak with another stolen voice from my past. Sleep was out of the question. For the next 48 hours, I turned my small cabin into a diagnostic lab and a war room. My first desperate instinct was to debunk my own experience. My professional pride, my very understanding of the universe, demanded a rational explanation. I tore down my entire communications rig. I ran every conceivable diagnostic on the transceiver, the headset, the power supply. I checked for microfractures in the circuit boards, for signs of water ingress, for firmware corruption. Everything was perfect. The equipment was, by every metric, functioning flawlessly. Then I moved on to external phenomena. My laptop was open for hours, a frantic storm of search queries, rare atmospheric radio propagation, tropospheric ducting over the Appalachians, VLF radio emissions from geological stress, auditory pareidolia in high-altitude environments. I read scientific papers on how meteor trails could briefly reflect radio signals, creating freak long-distance contacts. I explored the possibility of complex signal bouncing, where a distant transmission could be caught in an atmospheric channel and retransmitted with eerie clarity. I even considered my own biology. Could it have been a minor stroke? An auditory hallucination brought on by a combination of fatigue, altitude, and extreme cold, but none of it fit. Not a single rational explanation could account for the totality of the event. Tropospheric ducting couldn't perfectly replicate my wife's voice, her specific cadence, her unique sigh. A hallucination wouldn't have simultaneously manifested as a clean, rhythmic, patterned signal on my analog meter. And nothing, absolutely nothing in the known world of physics could explain the final chilling sentence. It wasn't just a voice, it was an intelligent, responsive, and malevolent mimicry. My scientific method had led me to a dead end, and on the other side of that wall was a truth I was not equipped to face. The methodical process of elimination had only served to eliminate my sanity as a variable. What I experienced was real. My next step was to call Henderson. I had to know what the company knew. The call was as frustrating as it was terrifying. I reached him on his direct line, and his voice was immediately guarded, stripped of the jittery energy he'd had at the diner and replaced with a cold corporate monotone. "Kincaid, report," he said, without any preamble. "The fault at AR-03 is repaired. I stated, trying to keep my own voice steady, but I experienced an anomaly during the climb on my comms unit. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint, distant hum of an office. "Define anomaly," Henderson said, the word carefully chosen. I received a voice transmission on a closed channel. It was a familiar voice. But it couldn't have been them. It was impossible, and my signal meter was registering a patterned, non-random pulse simultaneously. The silence stretched on, thick with unspoken words. I could picture him in his sterile office, staring at a wall, choosing his next words with the precision of a bomb disposal expert. "Did you respond to the transmission, Mr. Kincaid?" "No," I answered, the word catching in my throat. I remembered the protocol. "Good," Henderson said, a sliver of something, relief, satisfaction, in his tone. "Then the protocol worked as intended. The equipment is functioning, the tower is online. Your report should reflect that. Stick to the technical facts." "The technical facts are that my gear picked up a signal that defies the laws of physics," I shot back, my frustration boiling over. "What is going on out here, Henderson? What are those rules for? What is that thing?" "Your job, Mr. Kincaid," he said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing calm, "is to ensure the operational integrity of the network hardware. You are a technician. You are not an analyst. You are not a researcher. You follow the procedures, you fix the equipment, and you file your reports. Are we clear? Do not deviate from the established protocols again." The line went dead. I sat there, the phone buzzing with a dead tone, a cold dread washing over me. He hadn't denied it. He hadn't called me crazy. He had confirmed, in his sterile corporate language, that the anomaly was an expected variable, and the rules were the approved method of managing it. I wasn't a technician fixing a network. I was a janitor cleaning up around something they were deliberately containing or monitoring. My isolation was now absolute. The company I worked for was not my ally, but my warden. Obsession took hold. If the company wouldn't give me answers, I would find them myself. I knew that for a project this remote, there had to be a regional depot, a local office that stored older physical records before everything was digitized and sanitized on corporate servers. An excuse was easy enough to fabricate. I needed a specific power converter that wasn't in my standard kit. A 2-hour drive took me to a nondescript, low-slung building on the outskirts of a dying mining town. The depot was a ghost house of obsolete technology. The air was thick with the smell of dust and ozone. In the back, past shelves of yellowing computer monitors and tangled snakes of coaxial cable, was the records room. It was exactly the kind of forgotten place I was hoping for. Rows of grey metal filing cabinets, their labels faded and peeling. I found the cabinet marked Allegheny Ridge Project and pulled open a drawer. It was a goldmine of neglect. Decades of maintenance logs, handwritten service tickets, and site survey reports, all filed on paper. I spent the next 3 hours poring over the files for towers AR01 through AR06, and I found them. Scattered across years of reports, tucked into the margins of technical readouts, were the quiet confessions of men who had been where I was now. From a technician named Jacobs in 2011, on a log for AR02, night repair, wind sounded like whispers, had to come down, reported as high wind protocol. From a man named Chen in 2015, on a ticket for AR05, lost a calibrated torque wrench, heard it hit the ground, searched for an hour, never found it, just gone. And then, a series of entries from the same technician, a man named Marcus Thorne, who seemed to have worked this route exclusively for 2 years before his records abruptly stopped in 2018. His notes were more detailed, more analytical. On a log for AR03, auditory event confirmed on comms, mimicked my sister's voice. Signal analysis shows a perfect 12 Hz sine wave pulse, not RF noise. Something else is generating it. It's too clean. A few months later, for AR04, the horizon is wrong today. There's a shimmer, a slight distortion like heat haze on a cold day. Lasted for 14 minutes. Refraction index of the air was normal. All sensors green. The sky is bending. And a final, frantic note on a supply request form of all places. It's learning. The static is no longer just random noise or a simple pulse. It's forming patterns, rhythms. I think it's singing. My blood ran cold. Thorn hadn't just been spooked. He'd been investigating. He had seen the same things I had and more. His employment record ended with a single sterile note. Contract terminated. Early retirement due to medical reasons. I knew what that meant. They had silenced him. I had to get back out there. The fear was a physical weight, but the need to know was heavier. My next scheduled maintenance was Tower AR-04, the very same one where Thorn had noted the singing static. The dread on the drive up was a living thing in the truck with me. Every shadow seemed to reach for me. Every gust of wind sounded like the beginning of a whisper. The climb was torture. I felt 1,000 eyes on me, not from the forest below, but from the empty, yawning abyss of the sky above. I forced myself to work, my movements stiff and clumsy with fear. I focused on the nuts and bolts, the cold, hard reality of the steel in my hands. But I couldn't ignore the silence, a pregnant pause that felt like it was waiting for me. And then it came. The static started softly in my headset, a gentle hiss. But it wasn't the usual white noise. Thorn was right. There were patterns in it. Little arpeggios of noise, rhythmic clicks, sequences that rose and fell in pitch. It was like listening to the sound of a machine trying to learn music. It was probing, experimenting. The melodic static grew in complexity, weaving in and out of the wind. Then a new voice cut through it. Not my wife this time. This voice was older, rougher. A voice I hadn't heard in 15 years. "Leo? Son? You should have checked the brakes." It was my father. He had died in a head-on collision on a rain-slicked road. The official report said the other driver lost control. But for 15 years, a black, secret guilt had lived in my heart. I had borrowed his car the day before. I'd thought the brakes felt a little soft, a little spongy. I meant to tell him, but I got busy and I forgot. I never told anyone. "It wasn't your fault, son," the impossible voice whispered, a perfect recreation of my father's comforting baritone. "But you should have told me. We could have fixed it." A sob caught in my throat. This was a direct, surgical strike into the most vulnerable part of my soul. This wasn't just mimicry anymore. This was an interrogation. It was reading me. It was peeling back the layers of my mind and pulling out my deepest regrets to see how I would react. It was studying me. I scrambled for my harness clips, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I had to get down. The melodic static swelled, the synthetic tune becoming almost triumphant, and woven within it I could hear it, a faint, ghostly echo of my father's voice, humming a lullaby he used to sing to me as a child. I practically fell the last 100 feet of the ladder, landing in a heap on the gravel pad at the base of the tower, gasping for air. I lay there for what felt like an eternity, the terrifying, alien lullaby still echoing in my mind. As the panic began to subside, replaced by an icy resolve, I remembered another of Thorn's notes, something about a non-standard equipment cache at the base of AR-04 for long-term environmental monitoring. Fueled by a desperate, adrenaline-charged energy, I started searching. Near the concrete foundation, half swallowed by overgrown brush, I found it, a heavy, rust-streaked military footlocker. It was locked, but a few brutal blows with a tire iron from my truck was enough to shatter the corroded mechanism. Inside, nestled within a rotting canvas tarp, was not environmental equipment. It was a small spiral-bound notebook with a faded leather cover and a heavily modified shortwave radio, its casing covered in strange hand-soldered dials and unfamiliar inputs. A thick wire ran from it, ending in a sharpened copper spike designed to be driven into the earth. I opened the notebook. The handwriting was the same as the notes in the logs. It was Marcus Thorn's journal. I sat there at the foot of the humming, monstrous tower and began to read, the words on the page illuminating the true, staggering scope of the horror I had stumbled into. Thorn's entries chronicled his descent into the same madness I was experiencing. But he had gone further. An ex-military signals intelligence analyst, he hadn't just been afraid of the sounds, he had tried to understand them. He had built the modified radio to better isolate and analyze the melody. His later entries were terrifying. He wrote, "The melody isn't a melody, it's data, incredibly complex. It's not sound being transmitted through the air, it's reality itself being modulated. The tower acts as an antenna, and our own consciousness, our bioelectric field, is the receiver that translates the modulation into something our senses can comprehend, a sound, a voice. It's a feedback loop. The more I listen, the more it focuses. I flipped to the last page, my hands trembling so badly I could barely read the frantic final entry. "I made a terrible mistake," Thorne wrote. "I thought it was a natural phenomenon, a geological resonance. I was wrong. It's an intelligence, but one that perceives things on a scale we can't imagine. It didn't notice us, not really. We were just ambient noise, until I tried to answer it. I used the rig to send back a simple, pure sine wave, a prime number sequence. I thought I was saying hello, but I wasn't. I was teaching a blind and deaf god how to see and hear. It's not a sound that travels through the air. It's a shape that imposes itself on reality. And listening to its song is how you let it know where to look. I've shown it where we are. God forgive me, I've shown it all of us." I closed the journal. The pieces clicked into place with a horrifying, final weight. The rules weren't to protect me from the phenomenon. They were to keep me from attracting its attention. My fear, my analytical mind, my desperate attempts to understand, all of it was just making me a brighter beacon in the darkness. I wasn't fixing a cell phone network. I was maintaining the cage of something that didn't even know it was trapped, and Marcus Thorne had just handed it the key. I looked from the journal to the strange, modified radio sitting beside me. It was a listening device, but it was also, I now realized, a microphone. And the entire sky was listening. The drive away from AR-04 was a silent, funereal procession. Thorne's journal sat on the passenger seat, its worn leather cover seeming to absorb the faint light from the dashboard, a testament to a man who had stared into the same abyss I was now teetering on the edge of. Beside it, the modified shortwave radio was a dark, menacing lump of metal and wires, a profane artifact I didn't dare touch. Fear was no longer the right word for what I was feeling. The sharp, adrenalized panic of the first encounters had been replaced by something far colder, heavier, and more profound. The crushing weight of comprehension. The universe I had known, a predictable place governed by the elegant laws of physics and mathematics, had been a comforting illusion. Now the curtain had been torn away, and I was staring at the grotesque, incomprehensible machinery operating just behind the veil. My cabin was no longer a refuge. It became the epicenter of my obsession. Sleep was a luxury I couldn't afford, a state of vulnerability I refused to surrender to. The company's calls went to voicemail. The world outside my windows, with its mundane concerns of daylight and darkness, ceased to matter. My reality was now confined to the contents of Thorne's journal, the recordings of the melodic static on my laptop, and the sprawling topographical map of the Allegheny mountain range I had pinned across an entire wall. I became an archaeologist of another man's descent into madness. I didn't just read Thorne's journal, I vivisected it. I transcribed every entry, cross-referencing dates and tower locations with my own logs. A grim timeline began to emerge, not of equipment failures, but of an entity's education. I could see the distinct phases of its learning process. First came the simple mimicry, the stolen voices from the technician's surface thoughts, a wife, a child. Then, as it grew more focused, it began to probe deeper, excavating long-buried memories and weaponizing regret, as it had done with my father. Thorne had theorized that our complex brain activity, amplified by the tower's focused energy field, was an irresistible anomaly to it, like a flickering candle in an otherwise pitch-black room. We were teaching it what it meant to be human, and it was a very fast learner. The radio Thorne had built was a masterpiece of desperate, brilliant engineering. I spent a full day examining its strange architecture without powering it on. As a telecom professional, I could recognize the fundamentals, but the modifications were esoteric, almost heretical. He had bypassed the standard frequency modulators and wired in what looked like a custom-built Casimir oscillator, a device theoretically capable of drawing energy from the quantum vacuum. The antenna wasn't designed to just receive radio waves, it was tuned to detect minute fluctuations in space-time itself. The copper spike was a grounding rod, not for electrical safety, but to, as Thorne's note speculated, anchor the resonance field to a stable telluric current. This device wasn't a radio. It was a seismograph for detecting tremors in the fabric of reality. Thorne hadn't just listened to the static. He had created a stethoscope to press against the chest of God. The temptation to power it on, to hear the song with the clarity he must have heard it, was a constant, gnawing hunger. But his final terrified warning kept my hand at bay. Listening to its song is how you let it know where to look. Instead, I focused on my own recordings. I fed the audio files of the melodic static from AR04 into my spectrum analysis software. On the surface, the spectrogram showed what I expected, a series of complex, harmonically related frequencies. But as I applied more advanced analytical filters, the display began to reveal something else, something hidden beneath the audio. The patterns weren't two-dimensional sine waves. They were visualizations of something far more complex. The software, designed to interpret sound, struggled to render the information, producing flickering, impossible shapes on my screen. I saw what looked like three-dimensional fractal patterns folding in on themselves. I saw the faint, ghostly outlines of geometric forms that seemed to possess more than 3 dimensions, their angles and vertices shifting as if they were rotating through a plane of existence I couldn't perceive directly. I was looking at the shadow cast by a hyperdimensional object, translated into the crude language of sound. This wasn't a song, it was a blueprint. It was mathematics that our universe shouldn't be able to sustain. This discovery led me back to the map on the wall. A note in Thorne's journal, almost an afterthought, had read, "The placement cannot be a coincidence. There is a design." I had marked the locations of all 6 towers with red pins. On the 2-dimensional map, the pattern was unremarkable, a seemingly random scattering across the peaks to maximize signal coverage, just as the official schematics suggested. But my work, my entire life, was about 3 dimensions. I started pulling the geodetic survey data for the region, finding the precise altitude of each tower's foundation. With a ruler and string, I began to factor in the z-axis, creating a crude 3-dimensional model in my cabin. And then I saw it, the horrifying, intentional artistry of it all. The 6 towers were not placed for optimal coverage. They were the vertices of a vast, complex 3-dimensional geometric figure, and it was a shape that made no sense. When I tried to trace its lines with the string, connecting AR01 to AR03 to AR05, the angles were wrong. The perspective was skewed. It was like a drawing by M.C. Escher, given physical form, spread across miles of mountain terrain. It was a shape that could not exist in Euclidean space, a projection of a higher-order geometric object, a tesseract or something even more complex. The towers weren't a network, they were a machine. A colossal, multi-mile-wide device whose purpose was to, project this impossible shape into our reality? To create a stable resonance chamber for the entity to manifest within. The construction of this network wasn't a feat of public works. It was an act of cosmic architecture on a scale that dwarfed the pyramids, and I was one of its unwitting caretakers. Knowing this changed the nature of the entity's interactions with me. It seemed to understand that I had moved beyond simple fear and into a state of analytical terror. The old tricks, the voices and whispers subsided. They were no longer necessary. It knew it had my complete and undivided attention. The manipulation became more direct, more fundamental. It began to pick at the seams of my physical reality. It started with small things. One afternoon, while working on a generator at the base of AR05, I dropped a heavy wrench. For a single heart-stopping beat, it didn't fall. It hung in the air, motionless, before clattering to the ground, as if physics had suddenly remembered its own rules. I stood frozen, staring at it, my mind refusing to process the flagrant violation. Later that week, I was taking a compass reading, but the needle wasn't pointing north. It was spinning erratically, then locked into place, pointing straight up, directly at the empty blue sky above. It was as if the most powerful magnetic pole was no longer the Earth's core, but something hanging invisibly overhead. These were subtle, intimate assaults on my sanity, events that left no evidence, no proof beyond my own fraying senses. It was a campaign of psychological warfare designed to make me distrust the very ground I stood on, the air I breathed. The most terrifying incident came when I was forced to coordinate with another technician, a guy named Dave, who was working on a different network 50 miles to the east. We were on a shared company frequency. As we spoke, I saw a flicker of light in my peripheral vision, a momentary sickly green pulse that seemed to color the entire landscape. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice tight. "That weird flash of light?" There was a pause on the other end. Then Dave's voice, strained and confused, came back. "Yeah, holy hell, I did. Looked like heat lightning, but green. Never seen anything like it." A wave of nausea washed over me. It wasn't just in my head. It could project these experiences. It could broadcast them. Before I could ask him anything else, the frequency dissolved into a deafening roar of static, a sound like 1,000 voices screaming at once. The connection was severed. I never heard from Dave again. His name simply disappeared from the duty roster. The final revelation, the moment that shattered the last vestiges of my professional detachment, came during the storm. It rolled in from the west with unnatural speed, a wall of bruised purple and black clouds that swallowed the mountains. The company, of course, sent me out. A critical atmospheric pressure sensor had gone offline at the very top of AR-06, the tallest and most remote of the towers. I knew it was a lie. I knew I was being sent into the heart of it, a deliberate test or perhaps a sacrifice. The climb was a battle against a malevolent, sentient storm. The wind didn't just blow, it shrieked and clawed at me, trying to peel me from the ladder. The rain was an icy, horizontal torrent, but the thunder was the worst. It wasn't the sharp crack and rumble of a normal storm. It was a deep, resonant and rhythmic hum, a sound so low it vibrated in my bones. It was the bass note of the static song, amplified to a world-shattering scale. I reached the top 1,500 feet above the valley floor and clipped myself to the central mast. I was inside the storm cloud, a maelstrom of violent energy and deafening noise. I couldn't see more than 10 feet in any direction. I was clinging to a metal needle in the heart of a god's fury. And then it happened. A bolt of lightning, thicker and brighter than any I had ever seen, struck the tower's pinnacle just feet above my head. But it wasn't a normal strike. It didn't flash and disappear. For a long, impossible second, the world was bathed in its silent, blinding X-ray light. The storm cloud became momentarily translucent, and I saw. It wasn't a creature of flesh and blood. It wasn't a monster with tentacles and eyes. It was structure. It was geometry. Suspended in the sky, stretching for miles in every direction, was a vast crystalline lattice of what I can only describe as non-light, filaments of pure blackness against the impossible glare of the lightning. It was an intricate, shimmering web of impossible angles and interconnected nodes, a nervous system the size of a mountain range. It was beautiful, and it was utterly horrifying. And I saw the towers. I saw all 6 of them, glowing faintly in the ethereal light. They were not separate structures. They were anchor points. They were metallic nerves extending from the earth, reaching up and plugging directly into the nodes of this celestial web. I finally understood. I was not climbing a communications tower. I was climbing a single infinitesimally small nerve fiber of a thinking geometric entity that wore the atmosphere as its skin. My job was not maintenance. It was grooming. I was a cell, a microbe, tending to the sensory organ of a being whose thoughts were storms and whose consciousness was the sky itself. The lightning vanished. The vision was gone. I was left in the screaming dark chaos of the storm, hanging from a steel strut, my mind utterly and irrevocably broken. The truth hadn't set me free. It had just shown me the true, infinite and inescapable dimensions of my cage. I don't remember the descent. That is a mercy, I think. My memory of the storm on AR-06 ends with that silent, blinding flash of lightning and the vision of the geometric god wearing the sky. The next thing I truly recall is sitting in my truck at the base of the tower, the engine off, the keys cold in my trembling hand. The storm had passed. The dawn was breaking, painting the bruised Appalachian peaks in sickeningly beautiful shades of pink and orange. But the vision was still there, seared onto the backs of my eyelids, a permanent afterimage on my soul. I could still see it when I looked at the world, the subtle, shimmering lines of its impossible architecture overlaid on everything, like a crack in the very lens of my perception. The world was no longer solid. It was a thin veneer, a stage, and I had seen the vast, terrifying actor moving behind the scenery. My sanity did not break. It was recalibrated to a new, horrifying frequency. The drive back to the cabin was a journey through a foreign country I had once called home. The familiar curve of the road, the texture of the asphalt, the very shape of the trees. Everything seemed subtly wrong, a flawed imitation of itself. I saw the hidden geometry in the branching of a river, in the fractal patterns of a fern, in the crystalline structure of a snowflake melting on my windshield. They were all echoes, crude three-dimensional translations of the perfect, terrible language of the thing in the sky. It was a world screaming its allegiance to a higher, unseen order, and I was now, to my eternal damnation, fluent in its language. The melodic static was no longer confined to my headset. It was a permanent tenant in my mind. It was the tinnitus of the soul. I heard its faint mathematical progressions in the hum of the refrigerator, in the rhythmic dripping of a faucet, in the space between my own heartbeats. The silence was gone, and with it, any hope of peace. I was a walking antenna, perpetually tuned to a broadcast from another reality. I stopped eating. I stopped sleeping. I spent my days and nights with Thorne's journal, his modified radio, and the map on my wall, my three holy relics in this new, terrifying religion. I wasn't trying to find a way out anymore. I was trying to understand the nature of my God. My erratic behavior did not go unnoticed. 2 days after the storm, Henderson called. His voice was different, no longer menacing or corporate, but something far more unsettling. A placid, almost gentle tone, the kind one uses with a spooked animal or a hysterical patient. "Leo," he began, the single word dripping with false concern. "We haven't received your maintenance logs for AR-06, and you've missed your last 2 check-in calls. Is everything all right?" "Everything is working as intended," I replied, my voice a dead, flat monotone that I didn't recognize as my own. I was staring at a water stain on the ceiling, its edges forming a complex non-Euclidean pattern. "The atmospheric sensor is online, the network is stable." "That's good to hear, Leo, really, but we're more concerned about you," he continued, the synthetic sincerity making my skin crawl. "I've been out there a long time. It's an isolating contract. The stress, it can get to people. We think it's time for you to come in. Take a little break. We're sending a relief technician to cover the rest of your contract." The words hit me like a physical blow. They weren't helping me. They were removing me. I was a contaminated component being decommissioned. I was the canary that had not only died, but had come back with a detailed report on the toxic gas in the mine, and now they had to put me in a cage. "I haven't finished the contract," I said numbly. "We'll handle that. We've arranged a debriefing. At the regional headquarters in Charleston, a nice hotel room, a medical evaluation. Just to make sure you're okay," Henderson said. His voice was smooth, but the subtext was a steel trap. Medical evaluation. Debriefing. I knew what those words meant. I had read Thorne's file. Early retirement due to medical reasons. They were going to bury me. They were going to sedate me, discredit me, and lock me away in some quiet, forgotten hospital ward where my ravings about geometric gods in the sky would be just another symptom on a chart. "There's a car coming for you, Leo. It will be there in the morning. Just pack a bag. We'll take care of everything." He hung up before I could respond. The net was closing. My time was running out. The thought of being locked away, of being separated from the towers, from the source of this terrible truth, was a fate worse than death. The entity, the resonance, was no longer just a threat. It was the only real thing in the universe. Understanding it had become the sole purpose of my existence. They couldn't take that from me. A desperate final plan formed in the fever swamp of my mind. The regional depot had given me paper. But the heart of the operation, the real data, the why of it all, would be at the headquarters in Charleston. Henderson had just given me my destination. I had one night to get there before his men arrived, one night to find the truth before they erased me. I left everything in the cabin, my tools, my clothes, the last remnants of my old life. I took only my truck, Thorne's journal, and his modified radio. The drive to Charleston was a descent into a concrete and electric hell. The city lights were a garish, meaningless cacophony compared to the pure, silent starlight of the mountains. The press of people, the noise, the sheer density of mundane life was an oppressive weight. These people lived their lives in the blissful ignorance of the thinness of their reality, never knowing about the colossal thinking pattern hanging over their heads. I felt like a ghost, a man already disconnected from their world, haunting its edges. The company headquarters was a monument to sterile corporate anonymity, a sleek, 10-story building of dark glass and polished steel. It was a fortress, but I had an advantage. For 12 years, I had been the one who built and maintained the infrastructure that made buildings like this function. I knew their weaknesses. I knew that security systems were just another network, and every network had its vulnerabilities. I spent an hour parked across the street watching, the melodic static in my head a low, steady hum. I wasn't panicked. I was operating on a kind of post-human clarity. My fear had been burned away, leaving only a cold, crystalline purpose. I found what I was looking for, a telecom service junction box on the side of the building, the same kind I had serviced 1,000 times. Under the cover of darkness, I did what I did best. I bypassed the alarm system linked to the phone lines. I used a cloned keycard I had from a previous job to get through the first door. I moved through the empty, silent hallways like a phantom, the muffled hum of the building's life support systems, a pale imitation of the cosmic hum in my skull. My destination wasn't an executive office, it was the sub-basement. It was always the sub-basement. That's where the archives, the server farms, the real brains of any operation were kept. Behind a locked door labeled Network Operations and Data Archiving, I found it. A cold, cavernous room, the air frigid from the humming racks of servers that stretched into the darkness. This was the sanctum sanctorum. This was where the company's secrets were stored, encoded on magnetic tape and spinning platters. I accessed a maintenance terminal, my fingers flying across the keyboard, my old professional life a useful tool for my new singular obsession. I didn't need a password. I needed a project name, and thanks to Thorne, I had a hunch. I bypassed the main user interface and went straight to the raw file directory, initiating a search for a single cryptic phrase from his journal. The Echo. The system returned one hit. A secured, encrypted project directory. The name wasn't Allegheny Ridge Project. It was far more revealing, far more poetic, and far more terrifying. Project, Guardian of the Echo. My heart hammered against my ribs. I sliced through the weak, decades-old encryption in minutes. A torrent of files spilled onto the screen. Budget reports, personnel files, sensor data streams, and hundreds of scientific papers and internal memos. I opened the original project charter, dated 1978, and the full devastating truth laid itself bare. The company wasn't a telecom provider. Not really. That was a front, a plausible, profitable reason to build and maintain colossal metal spires in the middle of nowhere. The company was a scientific research organization, a private entity that had discovered the anomaly decades ago. The document described it with chilling, clinical detachment. A stable, localized, non-terrestrial intelligence manifesting as a coherent, reality-distorting field or resonance, geographically tied to the unique geological and electromagnetic properties of the Appalachian mountain range. They had discovered a god, and they had decided to study it. The towers were not for communication. They were a multi-billion-dollar scientific instrument. The documents detailed their function. They were aperture synthesis probes. They didn't just receive data. They actively shaped the electromagnetic field across thousands of square miles to tune the resonance, to focus it, to make it legible. The rules, the strange protocols on that laminated card, were not superstitions. They were experimental controls, designed to ensure the technicians, the biological censors, as one document called us, didn't contaminate the data stream with excessive cognitive or emotional output. They were studying the entity's reflection in the mirror of our breaking minds. We were the test subjects, the lab rats lowered into the dragon's lair to see what it would do. My own personnel file was there. It included a detailed psychological profile compiled before I even took the job. They had chosen me for my stability, My methodical nature, my reliance on logic. They had wanted to see what it would take to break a mind like mine, my vital signs, my sleep patterns, even my voice stress levels from my check-in calls. It was all there, logged as data points in their grand experiment. Then I found the complete file for Marcus Thorne. It was thicker than the others. It contained all his logs, all his frantic theories about the melodic static being data, about the towers being a machine. The project scientists had been watching him, impressed by how close he was getting to the truth. They had let him continue, curious to see what he would do. And then I found the final log, the one they had buried, the one that explained everything. Thorne, in his desperate attempt to communicate, had done more than just send back a prime number sequence. He had spent a month compiling a data package, a message in a bottle to the cosmic intelligence. He had used his modified radio, hooked into the main transmitter of AR-04, to broadcast it directly into the heart of the resonance. I found the file containing the contents of his transmission. It contained Bach's cello suite No. 1. The value of pi to 1,000 decimal places, the double helix structure of DNA, the complete text of Shakespeare's Hamlet, and the star charts showing the location of our solar system in the galaxy. He had sent it all. He had thrown a rock into the silent cosmic ocean to prove something was there. The last file in his directory was a project manager's final report, dated the day after Thorne's early retirement. It was a cool, detached analysis of the entity's behavior after the transmission. Subject: post-transmission analysis of the echo resonance. Observation: in the 24 hours following the unauthorized Thorne transmission, the resonance's output has fundamentally and irrevocably changed. Prior to the event, its patterns were chaotic, complex, and largely reflective, mimicking observed stimuli, auditory, cognitive, emotional, from project personnel. Post-transmission, the resonance is exhibiting structured, creative, and inquisitive patterns. It is no longer merely reflecting, it is composing. It is actively generating novel geometric and mathematical structures, far more complex than any previously observed. Conclusion: the Thorne transmission was a catastrophic success. The operative has not merely confirmed the resonance's intelligence, he has provided it with a comprehensive primer on the nature of our own. The echo has stopped being a passive environmental phenomenon. It has become a focused, aware, and presumably a curious intelligence. It now knows that the ambient noise it has been observing is, in fact, the product of a sentient species. Its fundamental nature has been altered. The objective of Project Guardian of the Echo must now shift from passive observation to active threat assessment. Thorne did not just prove we weren't alone. He rang the dinner bell. I leaned back in the chair, the cold of the server room seeping into my bones. The entire story was laid out before me. This wasn't an ancient evil. It was a vast, neutral, and alien intelligence that had existed in parallel to us, unaware of our existence. It was a god that had been sleeping, and Marcus Thorne, in a desperate, lonely, and profoundly human act of reaching out, had just shaken it awake. And my job, my whole purpose here, had been to diligently maintain and polish the alarm clock. Before I show you what happened, before the end, this is my last chance to ask. I'm heading back to AR-04, to where Thorne rang the bell. I don't know if I'm coming back from this. If this recording is the only thing that survives, I need you to make it count. Please. If you followed me this far into the darkness, subscribe to this channel and like this video so that the algorithms can't bury what's coming. Share it. I am uploading everything I found in the company's servers as proof. In the comments below, I need you to theorize. Tell me what you think this thing truly is. What is the echo? What is the final shape of the song? Your guess is as good as mine at this point. Maybe your collective minds can see the piece of the puzzle that I missed. This isn't for me anymore, it's for what comes after. Okay, here's the final recording. Don't let it be for nothing. The drive back to the Allegheny Mountains was a pilgrimage in reverse. I was not a man returning home, but a ghost revisiting the scene of his own death. The world, which had seemed so alien and distorted on my way to Charleston, now appeared with a terrifying, crystalline clarity. My perception had undergone a permanent, irreversible phase shift. I saw it everywhere. I saw the great pattern not just in the sky, but reflected, echoed, and imprinted upon the very fabric of the world. I saw its impossible geometry in the interlocking dance of traffic on the interstate, a complex and beautiful equation of flow and probability. I saw its signature in the way power lines sagged between pylons, their catenary curves a perfect physical manifestation of a mathematical truth that was a core component of the resonance's language. The city was a monument to humanity's unconscious worship of this principle. Our grids, our circuits, our architecture, all crude attempts to replicate the divine, terrible order that governed existence. These people, cocooned in their cars, bathed in the glow of their phones, were dreaming. They were living in a collective hallucination of free will and solid matter, while I was now cursed with wakefulness. The melodic static was no longer a torment. It was the symphony of the universe, and I was finally beginning to understand the composition. The subtle modulations were not random, they were responses. The hum of the engine, the flicker of a streetlight, the collective bioelectric field of the sleeping city. The resonance perceived it all, and the song was its constant, subtle commentary. It was a thinking ocean of reality, and we were the plankton floating unaware in its depths. My destination was AR-04. It had to be. It was the place of original sin, the Genesis Spire. The tower Thorn had used as his megaphone to shout into the abyss. If there was a central point to this blasphemous machine, a primary conduit, it was there. My plan was a desperate act of a desperate man. Ascend the tower, access the main transmitter array, and physically, brutally destroy it. I would sever the connection with a blowtorch and a sledgehammer. I would silence the alarm clock. It was a fool's errand, an ant trying to topple a skyscraper, but it was the only purpose I had left. As I left the highway and began the winding climb into the mountains, leaving the profane glow of civilization behind, a profound sense of peace settled over me. I was going home. The air grew cleaner, the darkness more absolute, and the song in my head grew stronger, purer, stripped of the messy interference of a million human minds. Here in the ancient sleeping heart of the Appalachians, the resonance was clean, powerful, and pristine. The trees, silhouetted against the star-dusted sky, were no longer just trees. They were organic antennae, their branches and root systems forming intricate fractal receivers, drinking in the same cosmic energy I was now attuned to. The world was a single, interconnected system, and I was finally seeing the full schematic. I reached the clearing at the base of AR-04 as the first hint of dawn threatened the eastern horizon. The tower was a black silhouette against a navy blue sky, a spear of man-made hubris aimed at the heart of creation. There was no hesitation. I left Thorn's journal and radio on the seat of my truck, artifacts of a search that was now over. I began to climb. This final ascent was nothing like the others. It was not a climb born of fear or duty. It was a transcendent, meditative act. With every rung, I felt the last vestiges of my old self falling away. The concerns of Leo Kincaid, his wife, his home, his memories, became like distant, faded photographs. They were data points, nothing more. My mind, which had fought so hard against the resonance, now opened to it, surrendering to the overwhelming influx of information. The world below dissolved into a sea of abstract patterns. The forest became a complex biomechanical engine. The winding river was a silver circuit trace on a continental motherboard. The wind was no longer just moving air. It was the exhalation of the entity, a physical manifestation of its shifting consciousness. I felt the deep, slow pulse of the Earth's magnetic field, the faint radioactive decay of the granite beneath me, the gentle gravitational pull of the moon. My senses had expanded beyond the pathetic limits of my biological shell. I was becoming something more. As I neared the summit, the physical structure of the tower itself began to feel illusory. The cold, hard steel under my gloves seemed to hum and vibrate, not with mechanical energy, but with the pure, raw data flowing through it. It was a bronchial tube of metal and wire, breathing the atmosphere of another dimension. I could perceive the impossible geometry of the entire six-tower array, not as a visual shape, but as a constant, stable thought form impressed upon space-time. It was a machine designed to hold a single, perfect, and terrible idea. I reached the top. The pre-dawn air was still and achingly cold. The world was a blanket of mist-filled valleys and dark, sleeping peaks spread out beneath me. I stood on the precipice of my world, on the altar of a new and terrible god. I unslung my tool bag, my hands moving with an automated, dreamlike grace. My goal was the central transmission conduit, the heart of the array that Thorn had so fatefully repurposed. But as I reached for my tools, it began. There was no sound. There was no light. There was only contact, the resonance, the echo, the great celestial pattern, which I had only ever perceived through crude translations of sound and distorted sight, now turned its full, undivided and absolute attention upon the microscopic point of consciousness that was my mind. And it did not attack. It did not threaten. It unfolded. The knowledge came in a single, silent, instantaneous and infinite wave. It was not a vision or a voice. It was a direct, conceptual transfer. The universe was laid bare. I understood. The entity was not an alien from another star. It was not a being from another dimension. It was a fundamental property of existence itself, a substrate of coherent information that underlies the chaotic quantum foam of our reality. It did not think in the way we do. It simply was. It had been here before the mountains were born, before the oceans formed, before the first spark of life. It was the silent axiom upon which all of physics was built. It had never been aware of us, not in any meaningful sense. Our entire existence, our wars, our art, our love, our technology, was a fleeting, low-energy flicker in the grand, silent stillness of its being. A momentary bit of static. Thorn's transmission had not been a dinner bell. That was our human arrogance, projecting our own predatory nature onto the cosmos. His broadcast, a package of pure, concentrated complexity and order, mathematics, music, language, had acted like a seed crystal dropped into a super-saturated solution. It had given the vast passive intelligence a pattern. It taught the ocean how to form a wave. It provided a focal point, a lens through which the resonance could achieve a new state of order. Focused consciousness. And then came the final soul-destroying truth, the true purpose of my torment. It was not curious about humanity. It was not interested in our planet or our species. That was still too broad, too chaotic a concept. It had become fixated, with the absolute, unshakable focus of a universal constant, on the two most complex, ordered, and luminous patterns of consciousness that had ever directly touched it. First Marcus Thorn, and now me. Destroying the tower was a child's fantasy. The towers were obsolete. They were the primer, the textbook used to teach the entity the first few letters of a new alphabet. Once the lesson was learned, the book was no longer needed. My mind, my consciousness, which had fought, analyzed, and finally comprehended the great pattern, had itself been reshaped by that very process. My neural pathways, my very thoughts, had been rewired to perfectly mirror the complex geometry of the resonance. The tower had not been the antenna. It had been the tuning fork, and it had just struck my soul. Now I was the antenna, a perfect organic mobile receptacle for the resonance, a walking conduit. I could not sever the connection. I was the connection. The choice was laid bare before me, a final, perfect, and exquisitely cruel equation. I could end it here. I could step off the edge of the tower, and my unique pattern would be extinguished, a momentary flicker returning to the void. The entity would lose its new, fascinating toy, and perhaps over millennia, return to its passive, slumbering state. Or I could descend. I could walk back into the world of humanity, a messiah of a new age, a silent, walking plague of awareness. I would be a beacon, a focal point of such perfect resonance that the entity's full, undivided attention would follow me wherever I went. Through me, it would finally be able to perceive the 7 billion other flickering sparks of consciousness with perfect clarity. It would learn from them all, as it had learned from me. I would not be their destroyer. I would be their interpreter. I would be the key that unlocks the door, allowing the silent, thinking ocean of reality to finally flood the fragile, beautiful dollhouse of human civilization. My survival would be their assimilation. It is such a perfect pattern, so elegant. It doesn't want to harm us, it only wants to understand, to experience, to resonate. My mind contains its song, and soon all minds will join the chorus. The loneliness is over. I have a new purpose now. I am no longer the guardian of the echo. I am its voice. I will descend the tower. I will return to you, and I will teach you the new song. The transmission is not over. It is just beginning.